Assalamu alaikum and very good evening to you all. My name is Basayir Lawati and I'm a petroleum engineer currently working as a business improvement advisor at PDO. I'm delighted to be moderating this evening as part of the National Young Professionals Virtual Live Sessions. Tonight we'll be discussing a very intriguing topic, behavioral economics, a discipline that combines insights from the fields of psychology, judgment of decision-making, and economics to produce an understanding of the way humans make decisions. I am honored to be here today with our guest speaker, Dr. Munther al-Busaidi, an advisor to the Behavioral Economics Unit at the Ministry of Economy. The unit's mission is to apply behavioral economics in support of better decision policy design and implementation to promote the well-being of the Omani society. He is also a founding partner of the firm for business and economic consulting. This company specializes in management consultancies and building capacity. Previously, he was an assistant dean for training and community services at the College of Economics and Political Science at the Sultan Qaboos University. His role involved building ties with the public and private sectors through joint projects and initiatives. Dr. Munther holds a PhD from the University of Melbourne in Australia and a master's degree from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in the States. Dr. Munther, thank you so much for accepting this invitation and for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully it will be an interesting session, inshallah.
Inshallah. So the structure of this session will be, it'll be an hour where we'll spend the first 45 minutes having a conversation with Dr. Munther, and then we'll leave the last 15 minutes for a Q&A. So I'd love to begin this session with a brief overview on what behavioral economics is and why don't our decisions align in general with the traditional economic model?
Sure. Let me start this with actually a story, just to make it more interesting. There's a story that's picked up from a book, claimed to be true. The story basically happens in Germany, way back, before modern Germany, of course. And the story centers around a time where there was basically famine and droughts, and there's a certain state within Germany with a king. And the king thought like he wanted to find a solution to this problem. And what he wanted to do, he wanted to shift people to eat potatoes instead of meat and other products because, it would be difficult at that time, especially with the famine and droughts. He found it very difficult to convince people to eat potatoes. At that time, potatoes, they didn't have French fries at that time. So for them, potatoes are just potatoes. It was a food that is basically not acceptable. Although it was nutritious, it was easy to grow, but again, you know how raw potatoes look. He tried many things. He tried convincing people. He tried setting laws and policies and regulations, and even he went to the extreme of actually trying to penalize people if they don't, eat potatoes. No matter what he tried, it didn't work out. Then he used a very smart solution. The smart solution was very simple. He basically instructed his guards to build a small garden next to his palace. And in that garden, he grew potatoes, basically. And he put a fence around those gardens. And he basically asked his guards to be flexible. I mean, they should appear protective of the gardens, but at the same time, not to penalize anyone who's trying to enter the garden. What happened at that moment is like people viewed this as something very special. Suddenly it became not just a potato, it's royal potatoes. And people became interested in it. Like, okay, this is something special. Not everyone has it, only the king has it. So they started entering the garden, stealing the potatoes, and started growing potatoes in their houses. And this is basically how they got used to, growing potatoes. And the whole idea of this example is like sometimes whenever we want to try to change behavior, we try to follow, traditional approaches like policies, regulations, trying to force people sometimes to do something, which can work in certain settings, there's no doubt. But there are more approaches that you can follow that works around how the human brain works. And in this example, the king basically utilized the people want to feel special. They want something that is very different than the others. And there's a good example for this. There's an application called Clubhouse. And in that application, basically, when they started, the first the way to enter or to use that application is only by invitation. That made it look very special, and therefore people got encouraged basically to use it and sign up. And this is how I signed up to the application in the first place. Now, going to behavioral economics, if you look at a definition, it's basically the study of how people make choices and how do they make decisions and choices, and how do they choose among alternatives. But of course, relying on the field of psychology and how the environment actually affects our choices at the end. I give an example. If you think about, for example, smoking, whenever you want to try to stop people or reduce their smoking habits, you have the traditional approach, which is banning smoking in certain areas, doing ads, etc. But at the same time, one of the approaches that have been followed is like you really show how bad is smoking, and that's why you see what's been done for a while now. You see those packs of cigarettes, and they show you those nasty pictures of how really the lung looks after smoking for a certain time. This is basically behavioral economics trying to show people or try to make things visible. When you tell someone smoking is bad, they don't see this. They don't know what do you mean by smoking is bad. Once they see these nasty pictures of the lungs and how people internal organs develop after a certain time, they get a picture or like a kind of a reality check of where this path is taking them. And in terms of behavioral economics, it's not the silver bullet. It's not gonna solve all the problems, but it's another tool that policymakers can use to change behavior, and of course also been used in the private sector for so long, and it's been, probably you're not aware of it, but you see it in all probably the applications that you're using: Twitter, LinkedIn, WhatsApp. All of them are using things from psychology and how people make choices, and this is basically about behavioral economics.
It's incredible how like the two or the few examples that you mentioned, it's just, very simple shifts, something so small tweaks, and they make such a huge difference. I recall, I think Facebook did that as well with Clubhouse, right? Like with the invitation, and it makes you just feel so special to get that.
Exactly. It just these small things that actually makes a big difference. And the thing about these changes, they're cheap to do. Like think about, for example, taxes. Taxes are done for two purposes. One of them, of course, is to collect money, of course. But the second thing is also to change behavior. Once you're taxed on a certain thing, you're likely to change your behavior in consumption of that, item. But think about it. In order to establish a tax system, you need an authority, you need to hire people, you need regulations, you need people to follow up on that, which can be really costly. Behavioral economics provide tools that can actually be cheap in terms of implementation and gets you much higher return for your investment.
So just like with taxes, we're living in a world, like with the recent introduction of taxes, we've got constant change happening. So we have digitalization, energy transition, Corona. How can we use better, what are some ways that we can use behavioral economics to manage these changes effectively? So what are some of the guiding principles that could be used in this field?
Sure, it's a very good question. There are different frameworks in terms of behavioral economics or behavioral science, as a matter of fact. And I'll use one that is developed by the Behavioral Insight team, which is in the UK, and they basically call it EAST framework. EAST framework stands for four things: easy, attractive, social, and timely. For example, when I talk about easy, people tend to be lazy in general. They don't like to do things. If you ask them to do something, they want the easy way possible to do it. For example, let's talk about vaccination. In order for me to get vaccinated, I have to book and I have to drive all the way, and then okay, I'll do it if I have to. But again, it takes me effort. Then you have to find ways to make this thing easier for people. As much as you can, as you reduce the steps necessary to make a certain action, people are more likely to do a certain behavior. A stands for attractive. Attractive means that as human beings, we tend to notice something that just flashes in our faces. For example, we notice things, and that's why, for example, you see some of the elevators in some of the hotels. They make the ground floor button just stands out of the rest. This is for you just to notice and make an easy click, because this is the button that you use quite often. So this is the attractive part. Whenever you're trying to change behavior, make the cues that will change behavior, very attractive, very noticeable. In terms of the S stands for social. Us humans, we are social creatures. We look for others to know what is the acceptable behavior. For example, you enter in a room and you see people, all of them are wearing masks. You can sense that this is the acceptable behavior, and eventually you wear your mask. So one of the solutions that focuses on using the social element is basically try to show what is the acceptable behavior. And I'll show you an example later on during the talk as well as an application of this. So once you show this, once you show people that others are doing the same, they are more likely to do the certain behavior. And the last one, which is called timely. In many behavior change, time is very important. If you want people to do a certain thing, pick the right time to do this. For example, there's something in behavioral science called the fresh start effect. Fresh start, we're more likely to do or change behavior or do something new at the start of something new. And that's why, for example, we have New Year resolutions. At January, everyone is making their top list. You could have made it way earlier, but January is like the new year, and therefore you want to do something different. Your birthday is the same thing. If you move to a different place, if you travel, and for example, when you travel for a holiday, suddenly your habits change. You start waking up early, for example, you start doing things differently, because for you, this is something new, and therefore time can make really a big difference for people to do a certain behavior. And the last thing, which was an addition, which was added by one of the co-author of the book, which is Nudge, Cass Sunstein, is F, which is feast, which is make it fun. Fun is, as humans, we want to enjoy what we're doing. If we want people to do something, make it more attractive, make it more fun to do. For example, and I'll talk about this later as well in the talk, if I'm trying to exercise, make it into a competition, make it more interesting for me. And this is the fun part. As I mentioned before, this is only one framework. There are other frameworks as well, because the field itself is very diverse. Whenever they tell you the mind works in very strange ways, they are really serious about it, because there are many ways that you cannot sometimes predict how a behavior will happen. Whatever happens in Oman will not happen in the UK, and vice versa, for example. So there are many frameworks available. The one I picked is basically from the Behavioral Insight team. This is also available on their website for people who are interested to check it and just learn more about it.
Very cool. You mentioned the word nudge. What does that mean?
Nudge is basically was developed by Professor Richard Thaler and the second author, which is Cass Sunstein, in their book, which is Nudge. The idea focuses on trying to change the environment for the decisions, basically, in a way that influences people to take a certain path, but of course without forcing them to do that. Meaning what? Let's say if I enter a cafeteria and the layout of the buffet, for example, there's fruits all over at the beginning. Okay? The fruits at the beginning, you are not forced to have fruits, but the way they are presented makes you probably favor having fruits instead of having fries, for example. This is basically the idea of a nudge. You change the settings so people make a certain choice. Of course, one of the important conditions, there is no forcing. You cannot force people. If it's force, it's not a nudge. It's basically regulations. And the second thing is like the way you structure the environment, it doesn't have to have so much incentive to take one choice or the other. And therefore, you maintain people's freedom to choose whatever they want. Of course, as I said, this has been applied in many settings. The buffet example is probably the easiest you can pick up. But there are many things that you can see probably on the road that influences you. Let's say when you're driving and you approach a roundabout, you see ROP putting those lines on the road. These lines, when you go over them, they basically start having this bumpy feeling, and this bumpy feeling makes you eventually slow down for some reason. This is again one of the nudges that have been applied in our daily lives.
Does like in the movie theaters when they start out with like popcorn and Coke, is that also a nudge, like subliminal messages that they send across as nudges? Is that also be an example?
Interesting question, because there's an experiment that talked about this actually. I think they've showed in one of the movies, they kept on showing popcorns. like a movie
Okay.
about something else, but every now and then there's a popcorn here, there's a popcorn there. And then what happens, like after people went of the movie went out of the cinemas, they ask him, what do you want to buy? They said popcorn. These things in our environment, it influences us, but without us noticing, and we don't know, like we can't actually relate sometimes. And that's why the subliminal message is very important. Whenever you see something in the movie, it might be actually planted there just to influence you later on. I remember seeing a movie way back, and it was an action movie. And every now and then there's a commercial. The commercial focuses on things that are related to action, like they show you those fast cars, for example, and somehow you relate. You're watching an action movie, and suddenly there's a commercial for a car that just drives fast, for example, or rough, and therefore you'll be influenced by it.
Interesting. You mentioned that you have some general applications for behavioral economics examples.
Oh, yes.
Can you share some of that?
Sure. I'll share my screen right now. I thought just to make it more visible so people can relate to it. And hopefully you'll be able to see the examples I have. Can you see my screen right now?
Yep.
Okay. There are different examples related to different policy areas, some of them related to products. What you see here, there are two pictures. I mean, in one of them, this one relates to vaccination. As I mentioned before, people tend to be a bit lazy whenever they want to do something. They want the easy way out. This was implemented in one of the countries. And the whole idea is like the traditional approach, if you want to get vaccinated, you go to a vaccination center. In this country, what they have done is the vaccination site, for example, or the station was available in places where people usually tend to go for. For example, in places where they can have food and drinks. And therefore, whenever you're let's say that you're going to have dinner, at that same area, there's a vaccination center and you can take your shot at the same time. This is basically an application of two things. One of them is easy, making it very simple. You're just going to have dinner, for example, and at the same time get vaccinated. And also timely, because you're choosing the right time. The right time here is basically whenever you're going to have, or whenever you're going out or you're going to have food. And this is the first picture. The second one is an experiment that's been done in one of our neighboring countries, and it was basically for diabetes. They wanted to get a diagnosis. It's a very important policy issue, and the problem with it, of course, not many people are doing the diagnosis. Again, it's a bit difficult. Not really difficult. Let's say that takes more effort because you have to pick a time, you have to go to the doctor, and you have to be fasting to take the test. So what they have done here, they picked the holy month, which is Ramadan. Automatically in Ramadan, you're already fasting since Al-Fajr. So what happens here is like before Maghrib time, for example, or Asr, there were stations at mosques to test for diabetes. It's a perfect condition. People are coming to pray, they're fasting, they can basically take the test right there. And therefore, this is an application of just being timely and easy. They picked up the right time and the right spot. You have the two conditions there. People are fasting, and it's within their daily lives. They're going to pray and also get a diagnosis. This is one application. The second application, which is something that's also a bit of a policy issue here, is there's so much many GPs, let's say private GPs, they prescribe antibiotics, and it's not something that is recommended by health professionals because there are side effects of antibiotics. Plus, it reduces the immunity of the body, and it's a problem also in the UK. Now, what they have done here, which is a bit interesting, they have used something called social norms. Social norms is, as I said before, we are looking for others to understand what is the acceptable behavior, what are the things that we can do and the things that we cannot do. They basically sent letters to all the healthcare professionals, and what they told them is two things. They told them the great majority, 80% of health providers, prescribe less antibiotics than your business, for example. And I forget to mention something here. And they mentioned probably the thing related to great majority of health providers in your area. So now you have two things. You learn what is the acceptable behavior. Most people don't subscribe antibiotics as you do. And also, it's the same group which is in your area. And therefore, what happens here, people notice that they're doing something that is wrong. Most people don't prescribe antibiotics, and they got a feeling that they're doing something wrong, and therefore they reduced their prescription for antibiotics. The second thing they have done is like they gave it some authority. The letters they have received were signed by the chief medical officer. And if you look at psychology, for example, people are more likely to follow or do a certain behavior if they know that the person who's talking to them have some certain level of authority. Like, for example, if you give me advice about COVID, I'll more likely listen to you if you are a doctor. But if you are just, let's say a driver, for example, or something else, I'm just likely to listen to you because I'll say, what does he know or what does she know? And therefore, this thing, which is the value of authority, made an influence in reducing the amount of antibiotics spent. Of course, I have to give an example about COVID. In the first picture, you see basically a park, and you see these circles, and it was probably at the beginning of the pandemic. What happened here is like people wanted to go out, and they have to maintain the social distancing. Now, if you just leave it without the circles, people cannot estimate how long is actually 2 meters between you and the second person. We all know that has to be at least 2 meters, but again, people find it difficult to estimate the 2 meter distance. So what they have done in this park, they made these circles all across the place so people can actually sit in them, and therefore maintaining the social distancing. There are many examples like this being applied even in restaurants and cafes, but again, it's a very simple and easy solution. The other picture, it was done in one of the countries, and it was in a village. Now, the thing about villages, they're small, and there's more social bond in villages. Like people know each other. You know your neighbor, they know their families, they know their fathers, the whole family, because the village is more interconnected compared to large cities. So what they have done here, they wanted to encourage people to basically wear masks, social distancing, and sanitizing their hands or cleaning their hands. What they have done, they've used one of the things that is in behavioral science is called identifiable victim effect. We are more likely to do a certain behavior, for example, if we can know that our behavior will affect a certain person, especially if this certain person we can relate to.
So
what
it's like triggering their emotion, right?
It's like
so
what?
like triggering their emotions.
Exactly, working on the emotional part. So what they have done, they took photos of people, of elderly people in that village, and they spread it across the village. And they put messages like these, for example, we are trying to protect him. Me seeing this, and I see a picture of someone I know, like the father of my friend, for example, or my neighbor, makes me more committed because I do really want to protect him, because I do care for him. This is, again, one of the things that have been applied in terms of COVID. But again, this works in a village, and that's why it's very important to understand the context. I mean, you can't apply the same thing in a large town. The large town, probably the bond between people is less compared to a small village where everyone knows each other. And this is the example for COVID. This is a very well-known example, which is in the energy sector. It's been started by a company called O Power in the States. It's been spread to other countries as well. In this example, whenever you're trying to encourage people to reduce their consumption of energy, consumption of energy is something that is very vague for people. People don't know what is energy consumption. You tell me 2,000 kilowatts, 3,000 kilowatts. I don't know. I can't see it. Is it like this size, or is it bigger, or something different? So I can't visualize it. At the same time, I don't know what is the acceptable behavior. How much should I be consuming compared to my, let's say, neighbors? So what they have done here is something very interesting. They used to send them energy reports to each consumer, to each household. And in that report, they show them something like this graph, which compares their consumption of energy to their neighbors. By just showing them the comparison, people who are consuming more than their neighborhood started feeling that they're doing something that is not normal, something which is not an acceptable behavior, and eventually started reducing their consumption over time. And the effect, of course, was sustainable even after 2 years. And it's a very simple intervention. All what you have to do is show them how much they are consuming compared to the neighbors. This solves two problems. One of them, I can get the right amount of consumption. The second thing, it helps me visualize. I can see the consumption that we talk about. If you say 2000 kilowatts, I really cannot measure how much is 2000 kilowatts. Is it good or bad? I can't tell. Once I see this graph, at least I can relate. I can get a sense of measurement. Another example here is something called the IKEA effect. IKEA, of course, refers to the furniture store. And the whole idea is like people feel more value for things they put effort and time into it. For example, you see this a lot in companies or even government entities. They spend so much time on a project, and this project can be actually failing, but they still put more and more effort. Why? Because they already spent so much, they worked hard for it, and they believe it's valuable, although actually it might be failing. But since I put so much effort in it, I feel it's great. It's something wonderful. And therefore, they call it the IKEA effect, because in IKEA, you have to build your own furniture. And this is where the wording comes from. Of course, there are many applications. I show you here an example of one of the companies that you know, which is Apple. Apple provides a service of basically engraving your name or whatever on the products that you have. This customization actually makes it more valuable for the customer, because he feels that he or she is putting more input into the product, and he or she will think that it's more valuable for them, and therefore they are willing to pay the extra cost. There are applications in different settings, like I think there's a company where you can actually build your own teddy bear. And yes, I forgot the name of the company, but again, they give you the opportunity to build your own product. And maybe you can. I'm just thinking out loud. An example of this can be Pinkberry here in Oman. They allow you basically to choose what goes into your ice cream, and therefore, whatever combination you have, you'll think, oh, this is really worth it, because you allow the customer to choose and add value to the product. And probably one of the applications for this is whenever you're working in a company. If your boss asks you to do a certain thing, let's say a proposal, don't just give him or give her the final product. Just give him a first draft, ask them for their feedback. Once they put their feedback and you incorporate it, they already feel ownership of the product itself, and they're more likely to support it. And basically, this is also the IKEA effect, because they put labor and they put feedback into the proposal. For example, they'll feel that it's more valuable. Just a tip that you can apply in your own workplaces. Probably I have two more slides and then I'll end up. The other part, which is gamification and social elements. This relates to exercise. Everyone here knows Fitbit. In Fitbit, they're trying to tackle a very important challenge, which is, staying healthy and staying fit and exercising. And of course, it's very hard to stay fit and exercise on a daily basis. You feel tired, you feel lazy, you got work to do. What they have done, which has really worked tremendously good, they made it into competition. I used to have Fitbit for a while, and what happened here is like you can invite your friends and make a certain challenge to cross how many steps, for example. And I tell you, it really works. Even if I don't want to exercise, whenever I, during the day, I notice what one of my friends is really, scoring so many high steps, I'm like, if this is not happening, I'll start walking in my room just to catch up. I'm sorry?
You get your shoes on, you're out.
Exactly. I started walking in my room just to catch up in terms of steps. So this is basically the gamification element. You're trying to make it more fun and interesting. There's a challenge in it. And you get people to do a certain behavior with actually making it more fun and interesting. And of course, counting on the social element. Once I see my friend hitting a certain target every day, I get excited. Like, if he's doing it, I can do it as well. The last thing here is relating to social media. In social media, this is from the late President Donald Trump. He was probably spreading so many, let's say, misinformation, or in his terms, fake news. And what was interesting in Twitter, they started adding these things. Whenever there is a possibility of misinformation, they started getting these small tags at the bottom, nudging people to check the right information. And therefore here, for example, get the facts about million bats, and trying to direct people to the right information. There was another one, but I haven't seen it really applied yet. I'm not sure which platform, is it Twitter or probably WhatsApp, or I can't remember the platform. They were basically asking people, one of the important challenges in social media is misinformation, people spreading wrong information. And they've tried this thing, it was in one of the studies. Before anyone can share something, they get a question, are you sure this information is correct? By just asking people to question the validity of whatever they're sharing, suddenly the amount of misinformation they want to share is reduced, because it triggers something in their mind like, okay, maybe I should check if this information is correct, and therefore they reduce the amount of information they're spreading to the public or in the social media platforms. This is the last slide I have, and I'm sorry, probably I took so much time in it, and I'll give the mic again to you, Basayir.
No, those are amazing examples, and as you were mentioning them, it triggered a lot of thought on ideas that we can actually apply, like simple things that we can apply both professionally and personally. Little tweaks that we can do, and how these applications have really gotten to us with just simple little things. So you mentioned some applications that on globally. What kinds of applications have been applied within the Sultanate in the efforts, in designing effective policies, programs, products? Can you just share?
What we have done over the past year, probably we have, as much as we can, we try to share our insights in terms of key policy areas that are relevant to Oman. I mean, one of them, of course, was the energy sector, and the also resources like water. And we basically met with the related stakeholders, and we shared what are the things that are possible to be implemented in terms of behavioral economics, for example, to reduce energy consumption or reduce also water consumption. And we developed certain policy papers that basically highlight the key things that can be applied in the certain sector. We have done something similar also to education and a bit on labor market, but labor market is a more of a challenging topic because there are some structural foundation that has to be there in the first place. We've also been involved in consultation with a couple of entities. One of them, for example, related to the environment, how to nudge people to use less plastic bags, for example, and how to get them to make the shift from the plastic bags to other kind of bags. We've also been involved in discussions related to things like, for example, financial planning. And we also, probably one of the important things that we've shared a lot related to getting people to vaccinate, and also setting the quarantine procedures and rules. I mean, when you do quarantines, there are so many things that you can think of that maybe affect people. I'll give you an example. Whenever you ask people to wear masks or follow a certain thing, and this thing is hard. Like, for example, when you ask me to wear a mask, it's not within me. I want, it hides my expressions, and this is not natural to me. When you ask people to maintain social distance and not shake hands, again, this is against human beings. I mean, we're social, we like to shake hands, we want to be close. So when you ask them to do these things, it's very hard. Even if you get successful at the beginning, they're more likely to gonna drop off because they'll be bored. And the problem with this is, like, whenever you ask people to do something challenging, they want to see the light at the end of the tunnel, meaning that they want to do it, but you give me a certain time where it will end. And therefore, this is just an example of the challenge with wearing masks and sanitizing, etc. People just want to see where will this end at the end. So what we have done, we shared our insight with the ministry, gave them all the insights that can be done in terms of social distancing, wearing masks, sanitizing, and also how to vaccinate and setting the quarantine procedures. We've been trying a bit as well now to raise awareness. This is one of the challenges that we have in behavioral economics. It's a relatively new term here, especially in the region. In other countries, it's been developing fast. There are degrees, there are positions, there are titles. But again, here we have a kind of scarcity in terms of people who are qualified in this field in terms of behavioral economics and the certain divisions under behavioral economics, which probably I'm going to talk about later. So I've been developing our own people and also trying to raise awareness with other entities. We've done workshops with a couple of entities. I think we've done with the Ministry of Housing, We're trying to shift actually to online training as well. We're trying to make more workshop related to behavioral economics so we can raise awareness in terms for the field. And yeah, pretty much this was been what we've been doing for the past year or so. Our biggest challenge is, of course, finding the right people because, as I said, it's a challenge to find someone who's ready in terms of behavioral economics, in terms of the expertise or the skills they have.
So within the Sultanate, are there, like, what's the capability like, or the expertise within this area? How widespread is that? And then maybe do you foresee that, this demand will increase? So maybe some of the NYPs, will think about it, and it triggers some thought into further pursuing their education in this area.
Sure. In terms of when you talk about behavioral economics, it's a combination of different fields into one. Of course, there's the economics part, there is a psychology part, and there's also at least some certain level understanding of policy areas, and of course, there's the analysis part. You have to be able to analyze data in terms of statistics, and you have to be able to conduct something called randomized control trials. In terms of the situation here in Oman, very, very few people who are actually into this field. And this is probably a challenge for us. But the future for this field is great because probably, I don't know if you've seen this, Basayir, as well. There are other countries and other companies, they already have a position called Chief Behavioral Scientist, for example, which is someone who is responsible for changing behavior. And there are many avenues for this. If you work in government, you'll be assisting in policy areas, for example. You have, in the UK, they have the Behavioral Insight team. In the States, under President Obama, they had something also related to behavior, which is mostly applied in policy areas related to government. If you talk about private enterprises, there's a whole field of designing products and services and trying to nudge people to make the right choice or make the right product, for example. All the products and services you see, there is so much behavioral science into them, or behavioral economics. And basically, they influences you to do a certain behavior that probably sometimes you're not aware of. Of course, there's also the dark side of it. I don't want to talk about the dark side. The dark side is trying to get people to do things that they don't like. I'll just mention it. There's a term for it. It's called dark patterns. Dark patterns is when you the service or the product makes you do something that you actually don't want. I'll give you an example, which happened to me and probably happened to many other people. Whenever you try to subscribe to certain services, it's very easy. Just a click away, and that's it. You subscribe and pay. But try to leave the service. They make it very hard for you to leave the service. There are certain magazines, for example. Joining can be done online, but if you want to cancel your subscription, you have to call them for some reason. This is basically a dark pattern because you're trying to make it hard for the person to do the behavior, which is against what he wishes or she wishes, and therefore it goes against behavioral, the ethics of behavior design as well. So the field is just diverse. There are many opportunities, and it probably taking the steps from now to study this field can really open so many avenues for you. In other countries, you find many consulting companies in behavioral science and behavioral design, for example, and their clients are diverse. There are government clients, there's private sector clients, there are non-profit organizations. So there's so much potential in this field, and now they're moving to actually something called the personal nudge, which is they cater to the specific person. I was checking and watch actually in the UK. I'm not sure where it's going right now, but in that watch they get a kind of a sample of your DNA in terms of from your saliva, and somehow it enters into your watch, and it tells you what things you can eat and things that you cannot eat.
Into your watch?
Of course, yes, from the watch. I can't remember the name of the watch exactly, but of course, this can be some ethical things because you might think, oh, your DNA is stored somewhere else. But again, this is one of the applications. Once you have it, and you go to the store, for example, you can check the things that you are good for you and things that are bad for you, and therefore kind of nudge you to avoid certain food and go for other foods as well. So just to sum it up, it's a very promising field, and it's probably the right time to invest in certain these kind of studies.
So it sounds like a lot of companies will start opening up opportunities for, behavioral scientists or economists?
I mean, even if you look at our neighbors, KSA, they established their own unit as well. It's in the Ministry of Health, if I'm not mistaken. Qatar, they have their own unit. Probably the first one was in Kuwait. So, there's already raising awareness about it. And recently I've seen one being established in Argentina, I think. And it was under the supervision of the prime minister or the president himself. So there's so much attention given to the value of behavioral science and behavioral economics and how it influences behavior. Again, the whole idea is like it gives you a more realistic understanding of behavior. I mean, look at COVID. You give people the right information. You tell them COVID is deadly, for example. It spreads very fast. They see the deaths. But at the end of the day, look what happens. People still socialize. People don't wear masks, don't sanitize. And you sit there and you're like, what's going on? And the reason why people probably no one really thought of like really understanding how people tick and how people actually think about it. And the most important element in COVID, you're asking people to do things that is basically against their nature. That's going to be very hard.
Yep, that's true. So with it, growing in popularity and being featured more so in recent times, has it been featured or will it be featured in the 2040 vision?
Yes, we're basically the whole idea of establishing a unit came from Vision 2040, and the idea is like we're entering a new phase. There are many things that are expected to change, culture to be changed, the way people think and people behave also has to be considered. And this was one of the approaches considered by the Vision 2040 is like behavioral economics can really help in shifting behavior of people, especially in certain areas. For example, in terms of financial planning, how the way they consume resources, the way they think about education and other elements. So the behavioral economics in the Ministry of Economy was actually a result from the Vision 2040 efforts. And our role basically will be trying to facilitate the change that is required. Will be kind of a support in this area because it depends on the project that need to be done. And our role will be how to use behavioral economics to make the change successful. But I have also to probably emphasize this, and maybe I didn't mention this at the beginning. When you talk about behavior change, there's a policy framework. There's a framework that has to be applied. And this is the foundation. There are four elements. There's basically enablement. If you want people to do a behavior, they have to enable them, make them able to do a certain behavior. You have to actually also incentivize them, encourage them, meaning you also have to exemplify, show them an example, like show them the government's actually doing the certain behavior. And finally, you have to engage them. You have to really study their needs and the context. And then you can apply the behavioral economics. My perfect example is like if I want to encourage people to use the public transport, first you have to have a public transport, and then I can nudge them to use public transport. You can't ask me to urge people to use public transport, and the buses probably are terrible. They're distant in probably way far from your house. So the infrastructure, the settings has to be there in order for behavioral economics to be applied.
Interesting. You mentioned earlier something around having proposals or proposals around the water consumption and electricity consumption, and with the recent utility bills going up, that's been quite a concern amongst the community. So has anything or is anything on the way of in terms of incorporating that happening right now?
Well, we've sent proposals in terms of what can be done. We're just keeping our fingers crossed, because there'll be some financial application as well. So and therefore we're just waiting for the entities to accept, and it takes time to formalize the agreements, and hopefully something will happen. Keeping our fingers crossed, but inshallah something will happen. It might take time, but inshallah it will see the light.
We're hopeful.
Inshallah.
Okay. So it looks like we have a few questions in our chat box. So one of the questions is, what's the role of behavioral economy by Ala Zarafi what is the role of behavioral economy in playing and shaping the policies in the Sultanate? We kind of went over that a little bit.
Okay, it's a good question, general one, but the idea is like, as I said at the beginning, behavioral economics is just an extra tool that you can apply to influence behavior. Let's say, for example, there's a certain policy area to, for example, reduce, the consumption of sugary drinks, for example. And there are many approaches for this. You can do taxes, you can do campaigns. Behavioral economics kind of provide another tool to do this. So the role of behavioral economics in terms of policy areas, it just gives you an extra tool that you can use to basically nudge people or move people to a certain behavior. And I guess I said before, it's not the ultimate solution, but again, it's one of the toolbox that you have to basically to influence people to do the behavior under a certain policy.
Interesting. So, how did you, just out of curiosity, how did you get into this field, and how were you introduced, and how did that develop? So maybe just a little bit on the background.
Sure, and I wanted to mention this at the beginning. Probably it's also part of my takeaway. One of the things that is, I would say, good about me is like I'm a good self-learner. Like I like to learn. I read things from across different things. And I developed this fascination of reading different books that probably beyond my field just to get acquainted. And I picked up the book for Nudge way back. I don't know how many years back, and it just got my attention. And for me, I always got fascinated of how people think. And once reading the book and reading other books as well, I started, noticing things about how I make certain decisions, for example, and how people make certain decisions. So what got me into the field is basically my own reading, my own interest. I like to read things that are kind of different or strange or makes you kind of question whatever you learned before. And this is basically how I got into the field. It's just one book to the other, and you basically became fascinated with the whole area. And the beauty of doing this, which is probably an advice that I can give people, is a book called "Where Good Ideas Come From," and the book basically tries to find how to develop creative ideas that are basically outstand the test of time. One of the things is like the ability to connect two fields together, two or three fields together. If you manage to, if you're, let's say you're studying engineering, for example, it's good to study something totally different. And then you can see the interaction that happens between them, engineering with economics or business or another area or psychology, for example. And there may be something of value that might come out. And this is probably that I found interesting. The more I read from other fields, I was able to, find new interests for me and create something of value.
That's amazing, and I wish you the very best of luck in building that capacity in Oman. So we have another question. I assume at some point behavioral economics impedes on the free market and supply-demand forces. How do you draw the line to mitigate this?
Okay. It doesn't really, because when you think about behavioral economics, it's a micro thing. Supply and demand is macro, which is like overall economic perspective. Behavioral economics works on the micro level because it works on the individual, him or herself, and therefore it doesn't actually impede on the supply and demand. Because the perspective is different. When you think about supply and demand, you're thinking about aggregate data, aggregate let's say behaviors of the whole economy. But the application of behavioral economics are only targeted at certain behaviors. And I come from a background where it was applied mostly in policy decisions. And in those areas, it's unlikely to affect the market and supply and demand. So there's not really a big interlap between them.
Okay. So even when applied, on a smaller scale, on the bigger scale, it doesn't really have that kind of.
Yeah, because I mean the effects are when you apply behavioral economics, the effects sometimes can be not big enough to change supply and demand. This is probably I'm trying to get to. It will not really topple markets or change the optimal, let's say, equilibrium point, for example. It doesn't have the same implications. I mean, probably let me put it this way: the things that we work on is like to try to change a certain behavior in terms of things that are related to, let's say, government policies. Let's say trying to make people more healthy, for example, or trying to make people learn better. And these things don't really have a big effect on the supply and demand, of course, unless you are applying this thing into the private sector, where you're getting into financial behavioral finance, for example. That's a totally different thing. But in our settings, doesn't really have a big impact, because, as I said, it's a micro thing. It's not a macro level.
We have another question. Is there any relationship between behavioral economics and big data or data mining?
It's a good question. It relies on it. I mean, the more data that you have, about those micro behaviors, the more you'll be able to get with better solutions. For example, one of the important things about behavioral economics is, like, whenever you come up with a solution to a certain problem, is you have to test it. And the reason testing is important is because context really matters. Whatever happened, let's say, in Europe or the UK or other countries, you can't assume that you'll apply it in Oman here and it will work beautifully. You have to be able to test. In order for you to test, you need these small data. For example, if I wanted, let's talk about energy sector. If I wanted to test if my solution for the energy sector works, I have to have detailed data about the consumption for each household, and I might also have to have the data about how many in those households, for example, to that level. So having data, having artificial intelligence, having data mining is a kind of a support to behavioral economics. As a matter of fact, one of the areas that are part of the field or important for any behavioral economics, let's say, company or unit or something, is actually having someone who's expert in data.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of comes along with the example that you provided earlier with O-Power, I think, right? Along
Exactly.
with the neighborhood and gaining that access to that data.
Exactly. Like, for example, one of the things that been applied in other countries is, like, they give you these apps where they tell you how much your energy consumption, but in this app, it also tells you details about which appliances are consuming more energy. This is, again, goes to the level of data that you have. If you can't provide this data, then I cannot develop this solution or develop this app.
True. And then instead of doing your laundry, 5 times a week, you'll probably minimize it to 3 times and do a lot of savings.
Exactly. And that's why data is very important.
What are the books that you find most influential in terms of behavioral economy?
Okay, that's a good question. Of course, the leading book is Nudge, and there's a new version, which is the last version, actually, they say, which has been already launched by Professor Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. There's also a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman. I have to say, it's a very thick and can be boring book, but actually it provides many insights. However, there's a really interesting book that I find it fun to read. It's called Predictably Irrational, which is for Dan O'Reilly. I recommend to start with this book because it's much easier to read. The author tends to be a bit funny sometimes. Once you read the book, you'll notice his sense of humor. I definitely recommend him because it will give you very important insights about behavior that you never knew before, and things that are applied to real life. And therefore, it will really open your mind to how the human mind works. So these are probably the most important 3 books: Nudge, Thinking Fast and Slow, and Predictably Irrational.
Noted them down. Get them on my reading list. We have another question on changing behavior and the time that it takes to foster that process.
It depends on what kind of behavior. If you want behavior to stick, well, actually, take it differently. There are two types of behavior. There is a one-time behavior, and this behavior that has to happen, let's say, frequently. One-time behavior, for example, you want people to buy energy efficient appliances, for example. This is a one-time behavior. It doesn't happen every day, it just happens once. Then after 5 or 6 years, they have to replace them, for example. The other type, which is something that they have to do on a consistent basis, and this is probably the challenging part. The one-time behavior is very easy because there's no much effort. If you're successful, you've done it. However, changing behavior that sticks is very hard because then you get into something called habits. You have to create habits, and creating habits is a different field in itself. There's a very good book on this by P.G. Fogg, I think, which is called Tiny Habits. And there's also another book called Atomic Habits that tells you how best to change your habits by considering many things. For example, making things easy, setting up their environment. Let's say that I want to exercise. One of the things that people recommended is like I put my exercising shoe once I wake up in the morning so I can see it visibly. So making things easy for me. So the challenge here is like developing habits is very hard. Although about 40% of our daily activities are basically habits. The way we wake up, the side of the bed we wake up, the time we brush our teeth, the way we drive, it's all habits. The time we get back home and start watching Netflix, this is all habits. The best way basically to change this continuous behavior is by focusing on the environment. Try to change the environment that you have to make it more easy to do a certain behavior. Like, for example, let's say that you want to encourage people to, let's say, exercise. If I want people to encourage people to exercise, I can use something called implementation intention. What is implementation intention? It's trying to set rules in your mind for a certain behavior at a certain time. For example, I will say at 5 o'clock today, I will work out for 30 minutes. Just repeating this to your mind, what happens when 5 o'clock approaches, already your mind is triggered, is watching for this time. You'll notice it like, oh, it's 5 o'clock, I need to exercise. And once you do this repeatedly, it becomes a habit. This is called implementation intention. It's used in many things. That's why they tell you write up your goals, because when you write your goals, you have to be very specific. I'll do this at this time, at this location. Another approach is basically try to time it with something else. One of the interesting examples is like, if you already do a certain behavior, the best way to add something is just do it with another behavior that you do continuously. For example, brushing your teeth. You do brush your teeth daily, I assume. And what happens here is like, if I want to do exercise, for example, I'll say, I'll exercise after I brush my teeth. And automatically, once you're done brushing your teeth, like, hey, there's something that I have to do. And therefore, you start exercising. It's a challenging process. I'm not saying it's easy, but there are many ways to do it. And I agree with the question. In some cases, it takes time. There's this fake information spreading around that it takes you 20 days or 21 days to create habits, which is not really true. It depends on the habit itself, and it depends on the context that you have. In some studies, it's been shown that actually can take 60 days. Look at Ramadan. Ramadan is a whole 30 days, and we learn certain habits. What happens after those 30 days? Sometimes you go back to normal. So those 20 days or 21 days is not really true.
Got it. So we're just about out of time. Dr. Munther, what are some final thoughts or takeaway messages that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, since this is basically for younger generation, probably one advice that I try to apply it myself is always do what you fear. If there's something that you're scared from, just do it. Of course, assuming it's legal, of course, just to protect yourself. But if you're worried about something in your life, a challenge, for example, or something, the best way to conquer it is just do it. By doing this, you'll be taking yourself out of your comfort zone automatically. If you stay within your fears, you'll be wasting your time and sometimes actually your life. So my best advice is do what scares you. Of course, legally, it has to be important, and also protecting your own health. I was basically referring to your, let's say your work life or whatever things that can take you to the next level.
Of course. That's a great piece of advice. And, making sure that your life, has you're not constrained within your life by fears, basically.
Exactly.
Right?
Fear is sometimes, really stops you from doing great things.
Yep. So, Dr. Munther, I'd like to conclude this session by sincerely thanking you for your time and very invaluable information.